3. Ingredients. That is all it took. No grocery list, no recipe card, no kitchen gadget that costs more than a week's wages, just what was in the cellar, what was left in the crock, and what a Canadian grandmother could turn into a meal before the stove went cold. These are the meals that kept this country alive through depressions, droughts, and winters so long and hard, they broke everything except the people sitting at the table. And almost every single one of them has been completely forgotten. Hi, my name is Jeff, and this is Forgotten Canadian Foods. Number 25, lard and salt on bread. No ceremony, no technique, no second ingredient you have to go looking for. A thick slice of homemade bread, white lard spread cold from the tin, and a pinch of coarse salt. That was it. That was the meal. Prairie Homestead Diaries from the 1930s record this without drama, the same way they recorded the weather or the price of wheat. Bread and lard for dinner, no complaint attached, no explanation offered. Because in a farmhouse outside of Moose Jaw in February of 1934, explanation was a luxury the same as everything else. The lard was rendered at home. The bread was baked Saturday and stretched across the week. 3 ingredients that cost under 2 cents a serving and kept a body standing in a cold house until morning. Oral histories describe children eating at the counter while their mothers ate last, standing over the stove. It was not nostalgia in the making. It was Tuesday. We replaced this with processed margarine marketed as a health improvement. I will let you decide if that is progress. Number 24, molasses and oatmeal porridge. Before any child in rural Canada walked 3 miles to a one-room schoolhouse in January, this was in front of them. Coarse rolled oats, water, and a generous pour of blackstrap molasses pooling dark in the center of the bowl. Salt is just salt. Salt is assumed. A 5-pound bag of rolled oats cost 25 cents in the 1940s and fed a family of 6 for a full week of breakfasts. The molasses made children feel they were receiving something special when they were receiving something essential, the kind that stuck to your ribs like plaster. Every grandmother from Portage la Prairie to Prince Albert used that exact phrase independently. That tells you something about how true it was. Number 23, salt pork and boiled potatoes. Here is where half of rural Canada built itself. Salt pork pulled from the brine barrel, fried in cast iron until the fat rendered golden. Potatoes boiled in the same water the pork had touched. And somehow, between the fat and the starch, something happened that no recipe card ever fully explained. In Newfoundland and the Maritimes, salt pork was not a fallback when better food ran out. It was the anchor. A 3-pound slab cost under 50 cents and lasted a family of 5 the better part of a week. I tried this last winter. I did not tell my family what it was before I put it on the table. Nobody complained. One of my kids asked for seconds. Number 22, fried cornmeal mush. Prairie women cooked cornmeal porridge at supper, poured the leftovers into a loaf pan, and left it overnight. By morning, it had firmed into something entirely different. Sliceable. Dense. Ready for the pan. They cut it in thick slabs and fried those slabs in lard until both sides turned crisp and golden. The outside crackled. The inside stayed creamy. Same 3 ingredients. Breakfast with chokecherry jam, supper with gravy. 2 completely different meals depending on which direction you took it. This was daily fare from the 1880s through the Second World War. Then convenience foods arrived and leftover porridge started getting thrown out instead of getting a second life in the pan. We call food waste a modern problem. The grandmothers who developed this recipe would find that genuinely bewildering. Number 21st, canned tomatoes and macaroni. Before anyone called it pasta, there was macaroni. From Nova Scotia fishing towns to British Columbia mill towns, there was a pot of macaroni and canned tomatoes on the stove at least twice a week. Elbow macaroni, stewed tomatoes, a knob of butter. 3 ingredients. A tin of tomatoes cost 12 cents in 1954. A pound of dry macaroni cost about the same. Together, they fed 4 people for under 30 cents and left the pot clean. If you make this today with good canned tomatoes and real butter, it is not a poor meal at all. It was always a good meal. The poverty attached to it was circumstantial, not inherent. The grandmothers knew this. The grandchildren forgot it. Number 20, bread and drippings. Drippings were the fat left in the pan after meat had been cooked. In a household where a roast appeared once a week, they were never thrown away. Poured into a bowl, set near the stove to stay soft, spread on thick bread with a pinch of salt, a meal that tasted of the best part of Sunday, stretched all the way to Wednesday. Bread, drippings, salt. Mining families in Sudbury, fishing families in Lunenburg, farm families on the Saskatchewan Flats. The drippings were free. They came from meat already paid for. Throwing them away would have been like throwing away money. Dripping toast still exists in some older maritime cookbooks. It is described as a snack. The families who ate it through the 1930s did not eat it as a snack. They ate it as supper and were glad to have it. Number 19, mustard and salt pork sandwich. Cold salt pork, sliced thin, homemade bread. Yellow mustard, the sharp kind that cost a nickel and lasted a month. That was the cold lunch farm children from Steinbach to Saskatoon carried in a tin pail to the one-room schoolhouse through the 1930s and 40s. The mustard cut through the salt and the fat in a way that made the combination feel balanced rather than heavy. Children ate these sandwiches cold at wooden desks, while a single wood stove tried to heat 30 kids in -25 weather. They did not complain. The sandwich was genuinely good, and they knew it. Fat for sustained energy, bread for carbohydrate, mustard for sharpness. Someone understood nutrition without using that word. Someone figured this out at a kitchen table in Saskatchewan in 1928. No cookbook required. Number 18, oatmeal with lard and salt, the savory version. We talked about the sweet version up at number 24. This is the other version. The one nobody's grandmother talked about at the church social because it did not sound like enough. Oatmeal cooked thick on the wood stove, served not with molasses, not with brown sugar, but with a generous spoonful of pork lard melted in, and a firm pinch of salt stirred through. This was the breakfast that sustained farm labor from sunup through mid-morning without complaint or fading. The fat carried the calories further than sweetened oatmeal ever managed. The salt brought out a depth in the oats themselves, a nuttiness that disappears when you bury everything in sugar. Nutrition researchers who have studied traditional prairie diets have noted that the fat-soluble vitamins in animal fat made this version genuinely more sustaining than the sweetened versions that replaced it. Our grandmothers did not know that phrase, fat-soluble vitamins. They just knew it held. They knew the man who ate the lard version was still swinging an axe at 11 in the morning, while the man who had eaten nothing was not. That was all the science they needed. 3 ingredients: oats, lard, salt. One of the most quietly intelligent breakfasts ever served on Canadian soil. Number 17, boiled turnip with salt pork. The turnip does not have a strong following in modern Canadian kitchens. I say this as someone who grew up being told to eat my turnip and choosing instead to stare at it until it went cold. I was wrong. I am willing to admit this publicly. A whole turnip, cubed, dropped into a pot with a piece of salt pork and water. Simmered until completely soft. 3 ingredients. The fat from the pork coated every piece of turnip and transformed it from the somewhat aggressive vegetable it is raw into something mild and deeply savory. Turnips kept through an entire prairie winter in the root cellar without rotting. They cost almost nothing to grow and even less to buy. In the worst years of the 1930s, when the root cellar held turnips and not much else, this pot appeared on the table 3 and 4 nights a week. People did not love it. People ate it and stayed alive. Which is, when you think about it, what food is actually for. Number 16, cracklings and cornbread. At butchering time in the fall, when lard was rendered from pork fat, the solid bits of skin and fat that did not melt down were cracklings. Golden, salted, intensely savory. And in households across the prairies and northern Ontario, they went straight into the cornbread batter. 3 ingredients in their simplest form: cornmeal, cracklings, and just enough water to bring the batter together. Baked in a greased cast iron pan until the top was golden and the edges pulled away from the sides. The cracklings distributed through the batter like pockets of concentrated pork flavor. Biting into a piece meant finding a little island of crisp, salty fat inside the mild sweetness of the cornmeal. It was the kind of thing that was impossible to eat just once, and genuinely difficult to explain to someone raised on store-bought bread. Oral histories from Doukhobor communities in Saskatchewan describe cracklings as the one thing children looked forward to at butchering time as much as the fresh pork itself. This is the cornbread version of that joy. Today, the same cracklings sell for $8 a bag at gas stations under the name pork rinds. Our grandmothers got them for free and put them in the bread. Number 15, vinegar and sugar switchel. This one is not a meal exactly. It is what you drank when you had almost nothing left in the pot and children were still hungry. Apple cider vinegar, water, and a spoonful of molasses, mixed cold and drunk from a tin cup. 3 ingredients. Harvest crews across the prairies drank switchel from wooden buckets in the field through the 1880s and the 1890s. It prevented dehydration in a way plain water did not. Grandmothers knew this the way they knew most things, not from a study or a pamphlet, but from watching what happened to the men who drank it versus the men who did not. In Acadian communities in Nova Scotia, a version made with apple cider vinegar and maple syrup was called Haymaker's Punch and appeared at every harvest table through the 1940s. Sharp and bright and cold in a way that cut through the dust of a harvest afternoon like nothing else. Sports drink companies have since bottled the same principle and charged $4 for it. Number 14, potato and onion fry-up. Cold-boiled potatoes from the night before. 1 onion diced, lard in a cast iron pan. That is the whole recipe. The potatoes went in first and were left alone long enough to develop a crust on the bottom before being turned. The onion went in after, softening and caramelizing in the potato fat. Salt, and a crack of pepper if there was any. 3 ingredients. The most honest breakfast in the Canadian farm kitchen repertoire. This dish has been made every morning in farm kitchens from Prince Edward Island to British Columbia for at least 150 years. It required leftover potatoes, which were always there. It required an onion, which was always there. It required fat, which was always there. It asked nothing of the pantry that the pantry was not already holding. What I want to say about this dish is that it is still genuinely good, not nostalgically good, not good for what it was good. Actually good. The caramelized onion and the crisped potato and the salt are a combination that works in 2026 the same way it worked in 1926, and I will defend that position indefinitely. Number 13, salt cod and potato cakes. Along the Atlantic coast, salt cod was not a heritage ingredient. It was the basic protein fishing families depended on all year, and they could not imagine the table without it. They were soaked overnight, boiled, flaked, mixed with mashed potato, shaped into flat cakes, and fried in cast iron until golden on both sides. Salt cod, potato, fat for the pan. 3 ingredients. Salt cod cakes were not a Friday night novelty. They were the standard Saturday morning breakfast, the way oatmeal was the standard breakfast on the prairies. 1 whole dried fish cost less than $1 and made enough cakes for a family of 5 to eat twice. The right amount of soaking meant the difference between a pleasantly salty cake and one that made you reach for a glass of water every 3 bites. Every grandmother along the Fundy coast knew exactly how long her particular cod needed. That knowledge lived in the hands and the nose and the eye. It was not written down because it did not need to be until the grandmothers were gone, and suddenly it did. Number 12, bannock with lard and jam. Bannock worked in every corner of Canadian geography and every condition Canadian weather could produce. But the 3-ingredient version is the one that appeared at the poorest tables and deserves to stand here on its own. Bannock, lard, and jam. Not all 3 in the recipe. Bannock on its own, spread with lard, topped with a spoonful of whatever preserves had come out of the August canning, Saskatoon berry jam, choke cherry jelly, rose hip spread, if that was what the coolies had offered. Homestead diaries from the Peace River country describe bannock eaten plain as lunch and bannock with lard and jam as a treat that cost nothing extra and meant a great deal anyway. 3 ingredients that together meant the day was going well enough to count a meal as something more than fuel. That distinction mattered enormously. In years when it was genuinely hard to find reasons to feel that way, lard and jam on bannock was one of them. Number 11, bean and molasses pot. Navy beans soaked overnight, simmered low and long with a pour of blackstrap molasses and a pinch of dry mustard if the shelf held it. 3 ingredients that together produce something that no single one of them suggests on its own. The beans turn creamy and dense. The molasses darkens and sweetens and creates a glaze that coats every bean. The mustard cuts through the sweetness and stops the whole thing from becoming cloying. This pot went into the back of the oven on Friday night in Quebec and maritime kitchens from the 1870s onward, and came out on Saturday morning transformed. Mahogany brown, thick as mortar, smelling of wood smoke and sweetness. A pound of navy beans cost 12 cents in 1954. A tin of molasses was 20 cents. The pot fed a family for 2 days and improved with every reheating. There is a reason this dish still exists at church suppers and sugar shacks and hockey arena fundraisers from Trois Rivières to Truro. It is because 3 ingredients and 12 hours in a low oven produce something that costs almost nothing and tastes like it costs considerably more. The grandmothers knew this. The church ladies knew this. The hockey parents figured it out. Some knowledge survives because it is simply too good to lose. Number 10, beet and vinegar salad. Every prairie garden grew beets because beets kept well, grew reliably, and could be pickled in a vinegar brine that preserved them all winter, with nothing needed except a jar and a lid. Beets kept people fed and stored flavor for months. The 3-ingredient version that appeared on the plainest tables was simply cooked beets, apple cider vinegar, and salt. Sliced thin, dressed, and set in a bowl, it sat on the table beside whatever else there was. The beet provided sweetness and color and a particular earthy richness that went with salt pork and boiled potatoes the way nothing else on a prairie table quite did. The vinegar cut through the fat and sharpened everything around it. The salt brought the whole thing into focus. This is a dish that costs nothing to make and makes a plain meal feel complete in a way that is difficult to quantify, but completely real when you are eating it. Ukrainian and Polish grandmothers in the settlements east of Saskatoon made this with the beets they had put up in August, pulling a jar from the cold cellar in January when fresh vegetables had not been seen in months. A jar of pickled beets in February was as close to a garden as winter permitted. It was enough. Number 9, butter and brown sugar sandwich. I'm aware of how this sounds. Stay with me. A thick slice of homemade bread spread with real butter, dusted with brown sugar, and pressed flat. 3 ingredients: bread, butter, brown sugar. That is all. It was sweet and rich, and it tasted like something a child would invent if left alone in the kitchen, which is partly why children loved it, and partly why mothers made it without apology when the alternative was a dry piece of bread alone. A small bag of brown sugar cost a few cents and lasted weeks. The butter came from the family's own cow. Oral histories from Quebec describe a version called pain au sucre that appeared at grandmother's tables as the afternoon snack grandchildren asked for specifically, not the snack they tolerated, the one they asked for by name, not poverty, not shortage. The taste of a grandmother's kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon. That is what 3 ingredients and the knowledge of what children need can become. Number 8, cornmeal and bacon fat porridge. This one raised eyebrows when I started researching this episode, and then raised them again when I found it in oral history after oral history from communities across the prairies in northern Ontario. Cornmeal cooked in water to a thick porridge, stirred through with a spoonful of rendered bacon fat and a pinch of salt. 3 ingredients, no sweetener, no fruit, no nothing else. The bacon fat gave the porridge a savory, smoky depth that changed its character entirely. It was not sweet. It was not trying to be sweet. It tasted of the pan and the smokehouse and the farm in a way that stuck to a child's memory the same way it stuck to their ribs. Mining families in northern Ontario and Manitoba ate this through the 1930s and 40s because cornmeal was cheap, bacon fat was free, and salt was always there. What I want to know is why we replaced it. And I know the answer. Someone figured out how to sell us something more expensive that did the job less well. That is the story of about half the meals on this list. Number 7, dried peas and ham bone broth. A ham bone saved from Sunday's joint. A pound of dried yellow split peas soaked overnight. Water. That is the entire ingredient list for a soup that fed Canadian families for 2 days through the worst winters the country could produce. The peas dissolved over 6 hours on the back of the stove, thickening to something a spoon would stand up in. The ham bone contributed a smokiness that worked into every molecule until it tasted like something far more complicated than 3 ingredients had any right to produce. A pound of dried peas cost 15 cents in 1950. The ham bone came from meat already eaten. The water was free. Soupe au pois is still on menus in Quebec today, though the version that simmered since midnight in 1895 is not the version that arrives in 11 minutes at a restaurant in Old Montreal. Every child in French Canada grew up believing this was the taste of winter itself. Not as a hardship, as a comfort. 3 ingredients that became a whole province's memory. Number 6, choke cherry and flour pudding. Every August, prairie children went into the coulees with tin pails and came back with hand-stained dark purple. Choke cherries were too bitter to eat raw and too valuable to waste. The 3-ingredient version was the simplest thing imaginable. Choke cherries simmered with sugar into a thick sauce, poured over flour, and water dumplings dropped from a spoon into boiling water. The dumplings absorbed the purple syrup as they cooked and turned deep red black. Tart and sweet and slightly almond-like, with a substance that plain syrup over bread never quite achieved. A dessert on the leanest tables, a meal on the leanest days. The choke cherry bushes are still out there in every river valley in Western Canada. They flower white in June and hang heavy with purple fruit in August, the way they always have. The knowledge of what to do with them is nearly gone. The grandmothers who knew are mostly gone too. If yours wrote it down, I am asking you to find it. Number 5, lard, flour, and water. Flatbread, flour, lard, water. Nothing else. Mixed to a stiff dough, pressed flat with the palm of the hand and cooked in a dry cast iron skillet until both sides were spotted gold, and the inside had steamed through to something just barely soft. Homesteaders in the drought years of the 1930s made this when the yeast was gone and the baking powder was gone, and the recipe for bannock felt like it required too many things. 3 ingredients was the floor. This was the floor. And it worked. The resulting flatbread was dense and plain and tasted of flour and fat and heat. But it was bread. It was warm. It was made in under 10 minutes with what was left when almost everything else was gone. Oral histories from southern Alberta describe this flatbread on the table for weeks, running in the summer of 1936, when the crops had failed for the third year, and the dust had come again, and the relief payments were late. Nobody complained about the flatbread. They were glad for it. That is what this meal is. Not a recipe, a refusal to give up. Number 4, fried egg and potato hash. 2 cold, boiled potatoes, diced, 2 eggs, salt. 3 ingredients that together make one of the most satisfying meals it is possible to assemble from almost nothing. The potatoes went into the cast iron first and were left alone until the edges crisped and the starch caramelized golden. The eggs went in after, their whites setting in the potato fat, their yolks staying soft. Farm families across the prairies and maritime provinces ate this for breakfast through the 1940s and the 1950s, without thinking of it as anything remarkable. The eggs came from the family's own hens. The potatoes came from the root cellar. The fat came from wherever fat came from, which in a farm kitchen was always somewhere. The gap between how little this costs and how good it tastes is one of the largest gaps in Canadian cooking. Ask anyone over 70 who grew up on a farm what they still make when they want something real. I will bet you a jar of chokecherry jam. It is close to this. Number 3, salt pork, cabbage, and water, the boil. This is the meal that Mennonite grandmothers from Steinbach, Ukrainian grandmothers from Végreville, and French-Canadian grandmothers from the Gaspé all made independently and arrived at through the same logic. Salt pork, cabbage, water. Into the pot before noon and left there until supper. By the time the table was set, the pork had rendered into the water and turned it rich and slightly sweet. The cabbage had absorbed everything around it and lost its sharpness entirely. The house smelled of it for hours. Oral histories describe that smell the same way over and over. The smell of being in from outside, the smell of something warm waiting. A pork hock cost almost nothing. A head of cabbage cost almost nothing. Together, they fed 6 people and left a broth that became tomorrow's soup. Nothing wasted, nothing complicated. 3 ingredients and the knowledge of what to do with them. That knowledge is mostly not being passed on anymore. Number 2, milk toast. Milk toast became a phrase meaning something weak and forgettable. That is an injustice to every grandmother who made it and every sick child who ate it and felt better. Toast from yesterday's bread browned over the stove, placed in a wide, shallow bowl. Hot milk poured over until the edges softened while the top stayed slightly crisp. Salt. 3 ingredients. That is the whole recipe. Prairie mothers made this for children with fevers through the 1930s and the 40s because it was warm and soft and easy to swallow. Maritime grandmothers made it for the very old and the very young for the same reasons. In Quebec, it was called rôtis au lait and appeared on breakfast tables for children who were simply underslept. I put this at number 2 because of what it represents. This is the meal that says someone is taking care of you, not performing care, actually taking care. The medicine was not in the milk. The medicine was in who brought it. Number 1, rhubarb, pemmican, water, and flour. Here is the one food historians are only now beginning to fully understand, and the one that belongs at the top of this list because it is the oldest and the most important and the most completely lost. Rhubarb was the daily meal of the Métis Nation and the fur trade brigades that opened the Canadian interior. At its most stripped down, it was 3 ingredients: pemmican, water, and a handful of flour to thicken it. Pemmican, the food developed over centuries by the Cree and Assiniboine and other Plains nations from dried bison, pounded fine and mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, was dissolved into boiling water. The flour went in last and was stirred until the whole thing thickened to a dense porridge that sat somewhere between a soup and a stew and was something entirely its own. A single pound delivered more calories than almost any food of equivalent weight and kept without refrigeration through any prairie summer. The voyageurs who paddled the canoe routes of the interior survived on it. The Northwest Company shipped it by the ton. Métis grandmothers carried the recipe into the homesteading era, adapting it to deer and moose when the bison were gone, keeping the three-ingredient principle because it was correct. By 1910, rhubarb had begun disappearing from camp supply orders as rail lines made fresh delivery easier. By 1930, it was gone from almost every table. No commercial version exists. No restaurant serves it. The recipe survives in historical archives and in the knowledge of elder knowledge keepers in Métis communities across the prairies who are actively working to preserve it, understanding that what is at stake is not just a meal, but the memory of how this land fed its first peoples, and how that knowledge kept everyone who came after them alive. We now call the principle behind it an energy bar and sell it for $4 at the airport. What we are selling is a pale shadow of something that required generations to develop and decades to lose, and may take generations more to fully recover. 3 ingredients: pemmican, water, flour, the most important poor man's meal in Canadian history, and the one we should be most ashamed to have forgotten. 25 meals, 3 ingredients each, one story that runs from the Métis campfire to the prairie farmhouse, to the maritime fishing town, to the Quebec triplex kitchen. What I want to say at the end of this is not that we should feel guilty for the grocery stores we shop in or the full pantries we keep. Abundance is not a failure, but somewhere between the convenience aisle and the delivery app, we lost something that was never just about food. We lost the knowledge of what 3 things can become in the right hands, over enough time, with enough care. The grandmothers who made these meals were not working with limitations. They were working with what they had. They knew what they had, and they knew what to do with it. That knowledge was a form of intelligence and a form of power. A woman who could feed 8 people on 3 ingredients in February in Saskatchewan was not poor in the way we use that word now. She was capable in a way we have mostly stopped teaching. If your grandmother made any of these, she knew something the grocery store never taught. If you remember watching her hands in the kitchen, and you still know which drawer the lard tin was in, and you still know where the choke cherry bushes grow, that knowledge is worth more than you think. Write it down, make it once. Feed it to someone. That is all I have for this episode. I am Jeff. This is Forgotten Canadian Foods. Hit subscribe because we are just getting started, and there are a lot more grandmothers to remember.